Hello, dear listener. Welcome to the Future Seeds podcast. I'm your host, Cyprian, and in this show, I explore groundbreaking solutions to our world's unique problems by connecting seemingly unrelated fields such as technology, ecology, community, and spirituality.
This is episode 24, the second part of my interview with Donnie Maclurcan, a professor of economics at the Southern Oregon University in the USA, and an executive director of the Post-Growth Institute. In the first part of the interview, we explored the roots of capitalism, the creation of money, and question whether or not it can be fixed. In today's episode, we will explore what solutions Donnie offers to transition away from our current economic system, including all the possibilities that exist when considering the surprising advantages of non-for-profits and the ascent of circular economy and social entrepreneurship.
So we have four different types of not-for-profit organizations or businesses around the world. So we have consumer cooperatives where the members own the business. And here we have like Barcelona Football Club or Real Madrid. How many people realize no one owns those companies, no individual? So you look at Manchester United, for example, it's owned by private individuals and I think a consortia. No one owns Real Madrid. No one owns the Green Bay Packers in the US. They are member owned. And for your listeners, I'm putting my fingers up to say in inverted commas owned because it's very much nominal. You don't actually own any equity in the company. You just have a say in how the company's run. So Real Madrid, for example, and I think Barcelona as well, holds annual meetings where all of the members who buy their membership in the cooperative get to vote on resolutions, right? So this is some of the world's most famous football clubs. And that's the same for every credit union in the world. And here in the US, we have Navy Credit Union that from memory, its assets are around $500 billion. It's a not-for-profit institution. No one owns that bank. The second category we have is foundation-owned businesses. And as we said, IKEA is an example that most people don't realize. And in particular, because this is a really interesting example for your Australian listeners. There's been a lot written about in the Australian press about IKEA not paying taxes. There's a simple reason that IKEA doesn't need to pay taxes and or shouldn't be accused of not paying taxes because it's a not-for-profit. And most of the journalists have no idea about that. There are some pieces in that story that you can look into that are a little complicated, but having spent years researching it, ultimately it all stands up, which is that Ingvar Kamprad, the founder of IKEA, yes, he wanted protection for his company in the 70s from a hostile takeover. And he wanted to preserve his legacy. But he was also a man who lived very simply. He lived in a small house. He drove a little car. He was considered one of the world's richest men, but he never owned his company after he gave it over to the foundation. So IKEA circulates their profits back in, which allows them to be more innovative, increase their R&D budget. Another example of a company that was for profit for 7 years that people have no idea about is the Ford company, Ford Motors. Henry Ford took the company not for profit under the foundation. You've got the Guardian newspaper, you've got Carl Zeiss, you have, I'm thinking of the Bosch, the engineering company is also not for profit. There's a very small percentage of family ownership, but it's largely not for profit. So that's the foundations. Then you have government enterprises, governments that own businesses. Like we said, Saudi Aramco, the world's most profitable company. The reason the Saudi people, and putting aside for a second how we feel about Saudi Arabian politics and government and some of the abuses that happen in that country, there is a reason that taxation is not required of private individuals because the government's budget largely comes from the royalties from its national oil and gas company. That's a very different model. I mean, imagine if Texaco here in the US or BP in the UK was owned by the people, owned by the government. Think about how much less taxation we would need and how much more we could put into social programs, for example. You then have another model, which is the non-profit enterprise. And that's where non-profits have gone into business, which is the most incredible success story of the last 30 years. Whether that's community centers that have added in business activities, whether it's local gyms that have really gone into thinking of their services as something that can be sold in a way that still benefits members. All of these sorts of things.
So
And
the major difference is that all the turnover is re-injected into the structure,
exactly.
not into gigantic salaries.
Yeah, and so you see this, for example, with Mozilla Firefox, which is a non-profit organization. And what it does with its profit is it puts it back into the organization, which means often adding new staff, but also it will grant, it's philanthropic to many other projects around the world because it has the money from its profits that just goes back into the system. So it's a fundamental difference, which means that individuals in these companies begin their meetings, begin their activities by saying, what's our purpose? Because if your purpose isn't to make money for investors, then you've got to have a different purpose. And that's the exciting thing is in a not-for-profit structure, you don't have to do all of this B Corp piece. You don't have to be like, well, we want to have profit and purpose that are simultaneously considered equal. No, in a not-for-profit company, your purpose is your purpose, and you use profit as a way to advance your purpose. It's a means to an end, not an end in itself. And this circularity of profit changes everything. It changes the way that the organizational hierarchy works. You have not-for-profit organizations all around the world, like you were saying, a much closer relationship between top and bottom salaries. Now, the second you reduce inequality within a workplace is the second that you empower more voices, you give people more confidence to speak, you get more innovation. There's so many things that happen when we look at equality within a company. And when it happens in the society at large, when you create greater equality by money circulating and therefore giving people the ability to pay down their debts, you create, as Wilkinson and Pickett and many others have said, the conditions for human thriving. And when humans thrive, the manufactured needs that we currently have to overconsume, right? You will be happy if you buy this product, if you go on this trip, if you have this salary. All of those things have the ability to dissipate because we suddenly are working under a different motive. And that, Cyprian, is where the world needs to go. We need a purpose-driven world, not a profit-driven world.
It seems like we're getting that part of the interview where we're going to speak about values. When I hear what you're saying, I couldn't agree more, but I know by experience that a lot of people are attached to freedom and merit. In the business world, as a CEO, as a founder, you build your project, you lead it to success, and then you have this empire. Both your freedom, the free enterprise idea, and the merit that you've had to reach that incredible state in the world, that's something people are very attached to. And it's often a conflict if you speak with people who are ferocious defenders of capitalism. If you speak about shared ownership, if you speak about more regulations rather than less regulations, etc.
That's a great point. And I think I can jump straight in here to, let's talk about freedom. 4 years ago, I had a conversation with Joe Justice. He is an inventor, a designer of WikiSpeed, a car that is built by open source design, sells for less than $20,000 and gets 100 miles per gallon. So he created an open source car manufacturing company to compete with the Toyotas of the world. Now, something very interesting happened because Joe took the company not for profit from the very beginning. He said, I want this set up as a not for profit entity. And I asked him why. And he said, look, thinking of freedom, if I am innovating with a team around the world who are contributing to the code and doing iterations and sprints and all of these things on our designs, and they were doing an 8-day cycle on a new design at the time with a single warehouse. What happens when venture capital comes along to fund, to invest? Or what happens when any investors come along? Well, venture capital is typically in North America anyway, ruthless. And Joe said the first thing they want to do is they want you to sign on the dotted line, and that dotted line above it, it says, At any point, we, the venture capitalists, can take your designs and do whatever we want with them, including throwing them in the bin. So you tell me how the average startup entrepreneur really has freedom. I would argue that the greatest freedom comes when you think creatively about how to raise capital and to do something within a not-for-profit structure where you don't have the constraints of the investors who are saying you need to do this, this, or this, or you need to think through a lens of profit maximizing. What's your return going to be like? Tell me about third and fourth quarter anticipated sales. When you can say, I'm putting the purpose here first, and I need to run a successful business to make a business model work. But in terms of legacy, and this is the crucial piece, right? You get Piaget, that developmental psychologist, who many of your listeners may know, talks about ages 55 onwards, that legacy piece, which is particularly strong for men in our cultures, thinking about like, what am I going to leave behind? Well, there can be no greater legacy, as Ingvar Kamprad realized with IKEA, than actually putting something over into a structure that protects it from a hostile takeover, but at the same time allows, with more profit circulating, for it to do more good and to actually grow in an appropriate way. So I would argue that, and I've had this conversation with a lot of Fortune 500 C-suite executives, and they get it. They're not necessarily ready to jump there, but they understand that there can be greater freedom and greater chances of legacy, less of the merit piece if we associate merit with salary. But if you have a sense of like, okay, what's enough look like, which most entrepreneurs in the startup space don't. If you ask them, how much is enough income for you in 5 years' time? They'll say, I don't know, because they're thinking about the open-ended possibility, right? But if you have a sense of what enough looks like for you to live a good and healthy life, if it's $200,000 a year, if it's $50,000 a year, if it's whatever, then I would argue if you put that piece aside, you can have more freedom, more creativity, and greater legacy, definitely greater legacy, using a structure that doesn't make you beholden to investors. And one more piece on this. Imagine you're the COO of Coca-Cola globally. And I come to you and I say, what would you do if I give you 2% more of your annual budget? What would you do? How would you feel? If I just said, here, I'm going to give you whatever that amount of money is, do what you want with it. The margins are so close often, especially in these kind of circumstances, economically, globally, that someone would probably say, wow, I can do a lot with 2%. I mean, I might throw that into my marketing budget. I might do this or that. I might throw it into R&D. I might, whatever it is. And I would then say to you, okay, you floated your company on the stock market how long ago? Long time ago. That's when you got your initial capital. You have plenty of assets and plenty of liquidity. Why are you hemorrhaging 2-3% to shareholders every year? And those shareholders are offering you no value. They're not adding any new money into the company. Why wouldn't you work out how to take that company private over the next 20, 30 years so that you don't have to keep bleeding 2% every year to your shareholders through dividends? It's crazy, Cyprian, when we talk about constraints on freedom and possibility, that for-profit companies aren't realizing they lose so much by being beholden to the investors that not-for-profits don't have in terms of the same circumstances.
Yeah, philosophically, employees are seen as being on the total outskirts, like a detail in the company, and shareholders are just so important. On that note, what you're saying just before, I saw Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez have an interesting debate on stage with someone, and you can see this difference of paradigm between, in most people's minds are like, if they reach that point, I made $1 billion. To which AOC answers, you haven't made $1 billion. You've taken $1 billion. You've used a lot of cheap labor to get to your wealth today. And I can see, it's a way to put it, but I can see just different ways of perceiving merit.
Both of those are true. Both of those statements are true in some respect, and both of them are false in some respect. But I think without the AOC side to it, it's very much an incomplete picture. And I would agree that so much of the capitalist system relies on extraction. And yes, the way of people, especially living here in the US, you see it all the time, which is that notion of, I created this, like you said, but without understanding on whose backs and with what implications for others in terms of environmental impacts. It's
Yeah.
very much a myopic view here about the American dream and how it's created. And that goes all the way back to denying that American capitalism was built on the back of slaves and indigenous folk. I mean, it's a deep, deep denialism that is pervasive here.
And still now, like capitalism thrives on some countries using cheap labor from other countries.
Which raises this great point that I'm amazed that this doesn't get picked up more often. When people say we need the global south to grow, okay, on what model? Given growth requires you have to have some kind of externalization. That's exactly what the global north did. Was it found its cheap labor on which to grow and cheap resources. Okay, where's the cheap labor market and the cheap resources for the global south to grow? Because it has to be cheaper than your local market economy in order to leverage from that advantage. So it's just the amount of falsities that are built into this perpetual growth narrative are startling. But the reason, Cyprian, that there's so many, and I'm going to be very direct here, the reason why so many assumptions are unchallenged is because no one yet has come up with a practical alternative beyond capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is why I really enjoyed reading this book. There's so many elements in it. Back on the topic of ownership, though, are you imagining a world where there's very little or no private ownership structures? Is that the ultimate goal?
Yeah, just to be clear, private individual ownership.
Yes, yeah.
Right, because we can have private ownership, which is essentially meaning non-governmental ownership. Yes, that's exactly what Jen and I imagine. There might be a small percentage of worker cooperatives or unincorporated or small businesses that haven't moved to incorporation. But essentially, we argue that in the future, you won't be able to compete in the market economy unless you are not for profit. So if I've got my, let's say, let's pick a manufacturing company, right? So let's say that I manufacture glasses for drinking, and you manufacture glasses for drinking as well. If my structure is not for profit and yours is for profit, all other things relatively equal, you just won't be able to compete with me. And the reasons are, first of all, I'll have tax advantages that you won't, most likely. I'll probably have tax exempt status. If I'm in Australia, for example, you can run a glass manufacturing company as a subsidiary of a not-for-profit. It's why Sanitarium, the Weet-Bix company, is, from memory, it's a subsidiary of Seventh-day Adventists. Right? It's run as a business to fund that church's activities. And so just like St. Vincent de Paul has the op shops, like Lifeline, these sorts of businesses that act in the everyday market economy. So we have tax advantages. I have the advantages of being able to say I'm not for profit, to be able to focus on my purpose. I don't have shareholders that I need to be paying dividends to. I'm going to have access to a lot of free services or discounted products as a result of being a not-for-profit. And of course, as society shifts more not-for-profit, some of these advantages change, reduce, etc. But this is something that's very underexplored in the world, is like the not-for-profit advantage. And it's particularly because in our assessment, most not-for-profits haven't thought of themselves as competitors and have wanted to keep quiet because they appreciate the advantages that if for-profit
Really?
business, yeah, because if for-profit businesses realized, as we sort of see here in the US, where credit unions are tax exempt, every few years you get a big upsurge of the big banks realizing the credit unions are taking more market share, and they try to put something through Congress to say tax them. But every single time it gets pushed back, and it's going to continue that way because we've now got 120 million members of credit unions. Let me just say that again. 120 million people in the US bank with a not-for-profit financial institution. They might not do all of their banking there, but
That's a quarter.
That it's way more than a quarter when you come to the financially active. It's over 50% of the financially active community. It's incredible, right? Remembering that there are lots of kids who don't have bank accounts, et cetera, et cetera. So there are things like that you would just say, what? How come that story never got told?
Yeah.
120 million people bank, that 26% of the global insurance market is not for profit. That kind of thing. You're like, what? I never heard about that, And it's because there's an investment in the dominant narrative, and it's hard for people to imagine anything outside of capitalism. There's that famous saying of, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism.
Yeah, and that's something, again, every time anyone offers something that's not in the mainstream capitalist narrative, it's stamped as socialist or communist, but not nicely, very aggressively. What is that aggression towards different philosophies around ownership and money?
Well, I think it's different in different countries. Like here in the US, there is a deep-seated fear, probably going all the way back to colonization, of where people were trying to escape. White folk are trying to escape a government that they felt was oppressive in terms of their religious freedom. So you have this deep-seated, like we see it here on the West Coast, libertarianism, where this anti-government sentiment. So the second you hear, and then this of course was expounded throughout the Red Scare, the Red Peril, all of these, this period of Cold War, where that threat was really pushed in terms of the narrative. It's why we see the difference between post-Cold War children who grew up after the Cold War finished, who have a much greater attraction and less closed-mindedness towards things like social democracy and notions of democratic socialism than you do older generations because of that embeddedness. But the fear is essentially, it's not just the obvious piece of stoking on this notion of government control, because this is an important piece. The left globally, when I say the left, it's an amorphous thing, but the economic left has not, in my opinion, done a very good job. And certainly we saw this with the Sanders campaign politically here, and AOC, I think, is falling into, unfortunately, the same trap of focusing on painting that alternative economic vision versus using the language that evokes a notion of state ownership. The truth is that a lot of what Bernie Sanders and AOC are promoting is about communal ownership, whether it's worker co-op down through to local not-for-profit businesses, through to partial nationalizations, etc. So no one really that I see that's being taken with any level of seriousness is talking about communism, state socialism, etc. But they are talking about socialism in a broader sense, which really, if you look at the definition of socialism, is about communal ownership. It's about not having private individual ownership of things. And that can take many different forms. It doesn't have to look like just state socialism. And I think, so that's this piece is, yes, you get pushback. And it's understandable because there hasn't been enough effort to think about the psychology of fear. And here's a really interesting piece. There was a Yale study done a number of years back, I think maybe 5-10 years back, that looked at conservative values versus progressive values. And before the study, they gave everyone a meditation to essentially allow people to feel invincible, like you're Superman, Superwoman, and you're safe, everything's safe. And then they asked a battery of questions relating to social and economic perspectives. Cyprian, something amazing happened. Conservatives, when they felt safe, shifted very quickly their views in a progressive direction.
Yep.
The lack of safety that exists in economic narratives, in the way, if you go into any bookstore and you read an alternative economics book and you open up chapter 1, it's going to be about what's wrong. The second you talk about what's wrong, takes you into the back of the brain, and you've started this fear-based dynamic that's very hard to talk about a new economy from that space.
That was actually one of the questions I wanted to ask you. What is the left doing wrong? Because so many countries are swinging right. And I think it has a lot to do with what you're saying. There's a lot of people who are afraid, and the right seems to be more agile, more better at speaking the language that these people understand.
Well, I would say that there's an amazing opportunity for the left. And the left has not fully understood framing and has not spent enough time investing in understanding social psychology. George Lakoff is an incredible example that if any campaign here in the US or anywhere around the world actually looked at his book, Don't Think of an Elephant, and took it in and practiced what he writes there, they would win so many more elections. We would see so much more economic change. He understands that these things are that we are behavioral species that operate often on underlying behavioral tendencies that have been patterned for a long time. And the language and the words we use, the hermeneutics, like what we think of when a word comes through, is important. So let me explain how I walk into a room of
Yes, please.
uber capitalists
Role
and
play
talk
time.
about, right. So imagine you're in a room and this has happened to me a number of times. So I'll think of the most recent example where I walked into a room having been invited to give a talk by a progressive woman, and there were 15 men in the room who were all in their 50s, 60s, retired, extremely wealthy, and they were all conservative. She was the lone progressive voice. So she invites me along and she's prepped them with a little bio of what I'm going to be talking about, which in itself is a bit of the challenge, right? So I walk into the room. The first thing I do in this space is I go and I drop my body height because they're all sitting down, and I sit and I meet every one of them. I make sure I get there early and I connect with them about something that is personal to them. What are you passionate about? Tell me about your life, etc. Make it about them. So there's a little bit of just relationship building. Because the second I walked in the room, by the way, they said, "Oh, here's the communist." So they already had this predetermined notion of who I am. Now for the key piece. Having built enough that they're going to at least open to listen to me, ready to probably pull me down and, like criticize, I start with this. I said, I am passionate about a market economy. I'm pro market economy. And I'm passionate about smaller government. And I want to tell you how we can have both of those things better in a not-for-profit post-capitalist system than we can now. The second I said I'm pro-market and interested in smaller government, you can see their eyes opened up because they were not expecting that, right? They're expecting, here's someone who's going to talk about increasing social services, paying for more environmental, Green New Deal stuff. Not at all. Not that those aren't things that I'm interested in, but I'm not going to frame it that way. I'm going to play to what they care about.
You'd be like, I'm a big fan of market economy. I'm a fan of reducing taxation. I'm a fan of reducing interference of government in daily life. And I'm going to show you how all these things work better without capitalism.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I'm going to show you how they're going to work, how they can work better without capitalism. The minute I said that, I had them in my hand. They stayed and talked afterwards for hours, like they were so interested, because you just have to realize this chasm that exists between the left and right. Essentially, it's all based, in my opinion, on similar values, which is, how do we make things work for our families? How do we make things work for our communities? How do we make things work for a broader area? And how do we essentially do this in the best possible way that recognizes achievement and these sorts of things? And the reason that we know that the values are core is because we've done this exercise around the world, Jen and I, for many years, where we ask people to draw a symbol or a shape that represents how the future would feel if it was working for everyone. And then we ask them to draw a symbol or a shape for the present and how it feels. Universally, Cyprian, universally across every kind of difference, pro-capitalist, uber free market through to anarchist activist, we see people draw the same shapes for the future and the same shapes for the present.
Really?
Without fail, the vast majority of people will always, when they feel into a future that's working, will draw either a circle, an infinity symbol, a spiral, or a heart. And for the present, and this is across cultures, all demographics, age, gender, you name it. For the present, they will always draw a jagged line, a triangle, a downward arrow, or a mess of lines, like a squiggly mess of all these lines.
That's so interesting.
It is, because it highlights that we all know that the future has to be circular, and that the current linear system, the future is non-linear, and the current linear system is problematic. No one ever draws a circle or anything circular for the current system, even though we have a market economy. So why does the pro-free market individual not go, oh, we've got circulation, goods and, money, goods, everything? Because they know that's not true deep down. And this is where, when we connect into our wisdom, all things thrive in nature on circulation. Oxygen, nitrogen, all things in our human body thrive on circulation, blood, oxygen again. Without that, whenever we have accumulation, they die. Ecosystems die. Leg gets gangrenous, etc. Our economy isn't fundamentally different. It's dying. It's actually, the growth is slowing down, and it's harder and harder to create growth. And therein, all of the environmental impacts associated with growth are continuing, but slowing down actually in an interesting way, although the overall size is growing. But the economy is actually dying because the money has been accumulating for too long.
And we're taking too much from the earth, such as we only have 40 years left of farming, I just read, because the soil is so depleted, etc. So let's talk about real circulation, as you're talking about circular economy and regenerative capitalism. We've spoken about the system, we spoke about theories, and we've spoken about the social issues. Let's talk about the earth, our beautiful planet now, and how we get ourselves human to think in a different cyclical, circular way now that matches how life works. So one thing you told me that was really interesting in our pre-call is that you didn't totally believe that circular economy was possible in the capitalist system. But I read Kate's book, and there's still a lot of elements that can be done, even if it's not, we can't paint the complete picture of a circular economy. But she was saying 5 reactions she sees when she speaks to big CEOs range all the way from, why should we do anything? We're making profit, to, well, we'll do it if that green change to our business creates more profit, all the way to, okay, we're a car company and we're going to create a system that we're going to be able to recuperate the parts of our cars and reuse them. But she was saying, it's amazing, but it's still not enough. By design, the economy doesn't really allow circular economy, regenerative capitalism. So would you expand on that?
Yeah, and I think this point is really well made. There was a study a few years back on the state of circular economy, how much of our economy actually is circular. And I think the data came in that it was 9%, right? So in other words, so much of what gets created, which by the way is what GDP is about. It's that original manufacturing piece, like what is actually being, what is being manufactured, whether it's business, services or goods. So much of our GDP and what it creates ends up in landfill. Not the GDP, but the actual the creation of materials, right? The manufacturing of materials, and this entropy, which this is important to come back to these laws of physics, right? You can't take something from a certain grade and upcycle it. We can upcycle things, but it always takes more energy for us to upcycle. You can't naturally. There's no natural process that takes a piece of coal without a long period of time of ossification. If you're going to burn that coal, you can't immediately turn it back into a source that can provide all of this energy. And so we have this entropy, this difficulty in our system that means we have limits, and we have to think about how to, as as Herman Daly explained it, slow down the use of products to the throughput, so that using recycling, using reusing, using these different principles, and recycling really is the very last piece of this, right? So you have the reduce, reuse, recycle. And the more we can reduce, that's the best winner. The next one is the more that we can reuse, and then recycling is the last bit. So Rayworth and others and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation focus a lot on that final piece. But it's a problem because you don't get a very big return from recycling. If Nike takes a shoe and they go and sell it and then someone recycles it, you're still needing all of the labor and the energy to create the shoe, to then run the recycling plant, to to actually recycle the shoes. All of the people who are managing that program, et cetera, require energy. There's a lot of costs that are embedded in the recycling piece. This is why ultimately you have to look at ownership structures, and you have to say, while we have profit that's driving these things, we're going to see companies focus more on things that can make them profit, which is where the recycling piece is so big, because it's easier to think of making money out of recycling than it is out of reducing. Now, here's a great example of a company that's very close to, let's take it, it's REI, the consumer co-op in North America. I don't know, I think it's 500,000 members. It's a big cooperative that sells hiking clothing. You may have heard of Black Friday, right? This big day. It's probably gone global now, that in the US is after Thanksgiving, and it's where you get all the discount sales. REI puts up a notice every year for Black Friday and says, we are closed. Go and enjoy nature. We don't want you to buy stuff from us today. It's a very anti-consumerist approach. Why? Because as a not-for-profit, they're able to do that without the threat of being sued by their shareholders, but because they also understand the value of reduce. This is the same as Patagonia, right? A company that actually thinks about the longevity of its products. So the more we can move the needle to the reuse and reduce, the more we're going to have a chance at the circular economy. But I'm telling you, there is no way in a capitalist system. Think about it. How could all the businesses in the world that were for profit focus on reduce? So you move more to services, reducing the actual goods. Okay, how quickly is that going to happen? Are you going to see all of the companies that are making a lot of money out of cheap labor in China and India all of a sudden say, we're going to just reduce the amount of things we're producing? It's not going to happen in a capitalist system. Right? This is where we're dealing with a fantasy that, as Greta Thunberg says, these fairy tales of economic growth, this notion that we're going to be able to separate out profit maximizing behavior from ecological devastation. It's not possible. It doesn't matter how much you talk about the circular economy. And the best example of this was Interface, the carpet company that was held up as the darling. And they did amazing things. After Ray, the founder, the CEO, had an epiphany and realized his environmental impact, and he takes this company and he says, I'm going to set these targets that are going to be like world-beating targets on sustainability. I'm going to reduce, we're going to have Project Zero. By 2020, we're going to be at this margin, zero water usage, zero carbon emissions, reducing our water emissions by this much, et cetera, et cetera. This is a global carpet company. Think about carpet. It's very energy intensive, right? If you then read underneath their success stories, we did this, we got 70% here, we got this. You see, in the same time, we got 340 patents, for example, and we tripled profits. Okay, Cyprian, here we come to the very interesting piece that most people don't want to look at. So you had all of these environmental reductions in terms of your externalities. What happened with all of the profit you made? Okay, a bunch of people got a lot richer. What did they create in their communities in terms of the way people look at them and consume? What did they use their money for? Did they go and invest that money in really dirty companies environmentally? Probably, because so often our money gets invested in things we don't even realize if we're in a mutual fund, et cetera, et cetera. I would say that the environmental damage of that profit accumulation, and this is going to be hard for anyone who believes in these kind of companies, I would say it was worse and more damaging than the environmental benefits of all of their innovations combined. This is the
would it have been all right if they at least, let's imagine, took care of where they put their money?
If all of those profits, if Interface had been a not-for-profit and all of those profits have been going back into circulation and not increasing inequality, absolutely that would have been an amazing achievement. That's why I'm such a big fan of IKEA. Even though they have a growth model, they're not creating the overall meta growth narrative, actually. And this is hard for people to realize because this is, I think, the biggest fundamental failing of the new economy space is they think that the path to sustainability lies in convincing companies and individuals to reduce consumption. No, the path to sustainability lies in changing from a profit maximizing to a purpose maximizing economy, which means changing the business structure. And the best example of a group that understands this is Purpose, the Purpose economy folks out of in Germany that are working on custodianship and stewardship models because they realize that without a stewardship model, everything else is, you're, to use an expression, you're pushing shit up a hill. You're trying to paddle against the
In Australia, it's up Shit's Creek without a paddle in a barbed wire canoe.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I see the point you're making. I love that sentence you said, from profit-driven to purpose-driven. Do the legal structures already allow this shift?
Absolutely. And this is such an exciting thing that Jen and I discovered. Most people in this new economy space that engage with the ownership question that we've experienced think that you need a new legal structure, that you need to have like a for benefit organization or something that allows for investment in a certain way. No, right now, all around the world, as far as we've seen, first of all, nonprofits can use debt, right, to start up as a tool for capital raising. There are some restrictions on what activities nonprofits can do around the world, especially here in the US, in terms of their revenue generating. And I'm just talking about nonprofits. Remember, there's 4 different types. So you use the other vehicles like the consumer cooperative or the foundation-owned business or the government enterprise as vehicles where you're not able to use a nonprofit structure. When you I could name a company across every single industry in the world that exists as a not-for-profit structure.
I was just going to ask that.
Yeah.
So there is no difference between the activities of non-for-profits and for-profits.
There is not any area in the world, even through to coal mining, where we have not-for-profit owned coal mines, by like actually a non-profit owning a coal mine, which happens in Virginia, for example. There's not any sector that Jen and I encountered, and we're going to be launching a database of this pretty soon, where there isn't an example of a successful not-for-profit.
That's incredible. I love the social entrepreneurship, social impact movement, but I have not yet dwelled in different actual legal structures.
And there's one other thing that's amazing, and this goes back to this idea of like banking being the same all around the world in terms of that formal understanding of how money's created, etc. What Jen and I discovered was there was even though the differences in the specifics are very different across jurisdictions, everyone has the same fundamental agreement under law about the difference between a not-for-profit and a for-profit all the way around the world. Again, whether it's in Mozambique, through to Peru, through to Kazakhstan. And in Kazakhstan, there's a very high percentage of not-for-profit businesses, I might add. It's a really interesting case. You have, in these situations, the same agreement that not-for-profit means no private individual ownership. And that's amazing that everyone agreed we're going to make that differentiation under law. There's no other legal structures that are as universally distinct so that you can say, okay, that's a for-profit and that's a not-for-profit. Right? So social enterprise can be for-profit or not-for-profit. Cooperatives can be for-profit, not-for-profit. All of these things have this ability. So if you say, great, we've got an ability to distinguish and say, we want the system where they're all not-for-profit, it's relatively easy to be able to say, is it not-for-profit or is it for-profit?
And so the main consequence of having more non-for-profits is not allowing for all this massive inequalities to happen, and shifting from private ownership to stewardship.
That's
I
right.
think.
That's right.
Well, this has been an incredible interview. I think I just need to stop it because we've been talking for an hour and a half. I would love to continue. I had questions about AI and robots and everything, and how that was going to affect the economy.
Yeah.
But maybe we'll have to do this another time.
Sounds good.
There's something I do at the end of every interview. I would like to ask you to speak directly to our listeners and send a message to the world. Something that touches you, something that reaches you, that you would like the whole world to know. Have about 1 or 2 minutes.
When we slow down, when we spend more time in our hearts, when we connect with the sensations in our bodies, and we explore these big questions about the future, about sustainability, and how do we really get through this critical moment in history and time, when we drop into whatever those emotions are, the fear, the concerns, the hope, and ask the question of what is it going to take? How can we transition? How do we survive and thrive beyond collapse? Because we are collapsing. The interesting, curious, and encouraging response that all of your listeners will find is that we have a collective wisdom that will give us the answers we need if we're willing to feel into it. If we move beyond the intellectual exercise of discussing money and debt and economics and all of these things that can be easily abstracted, and we just feel, what is it that connects us, and what's it going to take for us to create communities and businesses and societies and cities and rural areas, etc., that work? When we feel into that, we will rediscover that there are already many examples of those things happening, and they all have the same fundamental principle. And I leave it with your listeners to do that exercise, to slow down and ask, what is it that binds all of the things that do work, all of the things that are pro-life in this world? What is it that is common to those things? And the answer to that is, in my opinion, the answer to all that we need to address in terms of how we transition over the coming decades.
Love your message. Thank you so much, Donnie.
Welcome.
It's been an amazing conversation. Everyone, if you want advice on how to transform your for-profit into a not-for-profit, you can head to postgrowth.org and have a chat with Donnie. I'm sure he'll be happy to talk with you.
Love to connect with people. Thanks so much, Cyprian. Really appreciate your time.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't hesitate to send us some feedback at info@futureseeds.news. We'd love to hear from you. In episode 25, we'll be presenting Jean Renouf, a lecturer in politics and international relations at the Southern Cross University, who will be unveiling the result of his study on socio-ecological resilience and how, in the face of climate change, there's a real emergency to build adaptive social structures for the years to come, and how we can go about doing that. Don't forget to subscribe to the Future Seeds podcast on your favorite app or through our newsletter on www.futureseeds.news to get notified of new episodes. The Future Seeds podcast is a project that is supported by its community of listeners. If you like the show and what it stands for, I invite you to head to www.futureseeds.news, where you can support the show for just $2 a month, be part of the Future Seeds community, connect with its amazing members and speakers, and enable this podcast to thrive. I thank you for your time and hope you enjoy the show and its exploration of alternative solutions to the world's greatest challenges.